When I first moved to Germany, I lived in Berlin for 10 years. Another 10 years after I left to live in the country, I decided the time was right to pay a polite visit and see how the city was getting on without me. It can be frustrating because it's still rebuilding after decades of first war and then division. The water table is so high in this area that water has to be pumped out of any hole that's dug, although some Berliners claim that half the pipes are pumping beer in. So, in what follows, a lot of the sites are behind scaffolding. Don't let that put you off. The oldest part of Berlin itself is, like so many of Berlin's historical attractions, mostly a reconstruction. It's the St. Nicholas Quarter, which was completely destroyed in World War II and rebuilt by the East Germans in 1987, in time for the official 750th anniversary of the founding of the city. With limited resources, many of the houses were rebuilt using modern materials, but with facades that gave an impression of how they might have looked. St. Nicholas's Church dates from about 1200, so was in fact more than 750 years old in 1987. The date taken to calculate Berlin's age, 1237, is the date of the oldest known official reference to Colonia. The earliest reference to Berlin is 1244, and not until 1307 were the two settlements combined into one. Not much else is known about the origins of these settlements, as many historical documents were lost in a fire in 1380. The area is also home to an inn called Zur Rippe, the Rib. The bones that are its sign are, according to legend, a rib and a shoulder blade of the last of the giants that lived here before the humans came. It's thought they actually come from a whale. Most of the rest of Old Berlin, though, is gone. St. Mary's Church is all that remains of the St. Mary's Quarter. After the war, the ruins of this part of the city were completely removed to make way for the new, modern East Berlin, the centerpiece of which is the television tower. This is the tallest structure in Germany and currently the fourth tallest freestanding building in Europe. It was completed in 1969 with a total height of 365 meters. In the 90s, the antenna was extended, giving the tower an additional 3 meters. Ordinary Berliners, with their typical brand of cynical wit, soon noticed that when the sun shines on the sphere, it reflects in the shape of a cross, a slight embarrassment considering the way East Germany strove to be an atheist state. And so people started calling it the Pope's Revenge, or St. Walter's, after the leader of the GDR at the time, Walter Ulbricht. Excavation work for the extension of an U-Bahn line recently uncovered some remains of the old city, most excitingly, those of the original City Hall. The U-Bahn station had to be slightly redesigned to avoid completely destroying them. The current City Hall was built in the late 19th century and still serves as the official office of the Mayor of Berlin and the City Senate. It's known as the Red City Hall for its actual colour, not the colour of its politics. A frieze around the outer wall depicts the history of Berlin from the 12th century to the founding of the German Empire in 1871. Nearby are the bomb-damaged ruins of a medieval Franciscan monastery, the so-called Grey Monastery. It is one of the last surviving examples of Gothic architecture in the city. Also in the area is Zur letzten Instanz, probably one of Berlin's oldest surviving inns. It was certainly there in 1561, although under a different name. It was built against the wall, not the famous wall that divided the city in 1961, but an older medieval wall that protected the city from the 12th century to about the 17th. As the city grew, the old wall was demolished and new ones built, but a few meters of the original remain. It was Prince Elector Friedrich Wilhelm who, in the 17th century, laid the foundations of Berlin's success. He instituted a policy of immigration and religious tolerance, inviting refugees to live in Berlin. 50 Jewish families from Austria, political refugees from Bohemia and Poland, and most importantly, about 6,000 Huguenots from France. The integration of this last group is honoured by the Gendarmenmarkt, with the Playhouse, originally the National Theatre, flanked by the so-called German church on one side and the French church on the other. Due to an unfortunate translation error, these churches are sometimes mistakenly referred to as cathedrals, which of course they're not. Over the next few centuries, Berlin grew into a city fit for a king. The city Schloss was demolished after the war to make way for a military parade ground, and then the main debating chamber of the East German government, the Palace of the Republic. This was itself demolished in 2008, and the Humboldt Forum is currently being built. The plan is for its facade to be a replica of that of the Schloss. One small remnant of the original, a single portal, was incorporated into the East German State Council building. Opposite is the Berlin Cathedral, completed in 1905 to replace an 18th century original. In the crypt are the tombs of many members of the Royal House of Hohenzollern. Right next door is a collection of museums and galleries. The Old Museum, with artifacts from ancient Greece. The New Museum, showcasing ancient Egypt. The Pergamon Museum, with the Pergamon altar and exhibits from Babylon. The Old National Gallery, with paintings and sculptures from the 19th century. The Border Museum, with its collection of coins and Byzantine art. Together with the Pleasure Gardens, now a public park, this forms what is called Museum Island. From here, central Berlin's main boulevard Unter den Linden leads to what was the Royal Hunting Grounds. Many important buildings were sited along this road. The 18th century arsenal once contained 150,000 weapons and trophies. It now houses the German Historical Museum. A modern reconstruction of the old commander's office. The new guard house, now a memorial to the victims of war and tyranny. The Crown Prince's Palace. The State Opera House. The Humboldt University was founded in 1809 and originally called the Friedrich Wilhelm University and housed in an empty palace. Opposite the main building is the Faculty of Law, but in the 1930s this building housed the University Library. It was here, on the 10th of May 1933, that books written by people the Nazis considered degenerate were burned. A monument in the middle of the plaza commemorates this event. Unter den Linden eventually leads to the Brandenburg Gate, which provides access to the Tiergarten. Originally a royal hunting ground, it is now a wooded park stretching west towards Charlottenburg. By the 1730s, Berlin had grown to cover roughly what is now the locality of Mitte. A new wall was built, but not for military protection. Instead, it was a customs wall so the authorities could control and tax imports and exports. Some of the names of the various gates survive as names of U-Bahn stations, streets and squares, so it is possible to trace the rough course of this wall. The Brandenburg Gate is the only one still standing, but it's not the original, which was a much more modest affair. King Friedrich Wilhelm II, though, wanted a fitting memorial to his recently deceased uncle. The new gate was opened in 1791, but not completely finished for another 2 years. The architect, Karl Gotthard Langhans, was apparently inspired by the Parthenon in Athens, but he'd only ever seen engravings of it and had mistaken it for a gateway. There is a myth that says that at some point in its history, the quadriga was turned around to face the other way. In fact, it has always faced east, as it represents, depending on who you ask, either peace or victory, returning to the city. It was coincidence that in 1961 the infamous Berlin Wall happened to follow the course of the 18th century customs wall at this point, leaving the Brandenburg Gate stranded in no man's land, a potent symbol of the Iron Curtain, a gate through which none could pass. The buildings around Pariser Platz are all post-reunification, some of them copies of the originals. The Hotel Adlon was originally built in 1907. The new version opened 90 years later. This is the hotel from where Michael Jackson famously dangled his son in 2002. If you're wondering, a night in the presidential suite will probably cost you about 16,000 euros. The famous Jewish artist Max Liebermann lived in the house that stood here. On the night that the Nazis paraded through the gate, he is said to have commented that he couldn't eat the amount he would like to puke. Berlin continued to grow throughout the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution took hold, and the railways came, bringing increased mobility. One of the original stations was the Anhalt station, the terminus for trains from the southwest, opened in 1836. Badly damaged during the war, only the underground S-Bahn platforms and one small part of the facade remain. In 1871, Berlin was elevated from being just the capital of Prussia and became the capital city of a new, unified German nation-state, the German Empire. This new nation needed a parliament, the Reichstag, and this body met in the purpose-built Reichstag building, completed in 1894 and later dedicated to the German nation. The various coats of arms depicted either side of the main entrance represent the states that had unified to become one country. The original copper dome was destroyed in the 1933 fire, which the Nazis blamed on their political opponents. The new dome, to the eternal delight of German political satirists, helps keep heating costs down by recirculating hot air from the debating chamber. Although the building is known as the Reichstag, the body that meets there now is called the Bundestag. Berlin's new status provided more impetus for more growth. The period known as the Gründerzeit brought to Berlin and its neighbouring towns prosperity and a new middle class, and with it values such as honour, learning, civility, politeness and correctness, as well as deference to authority. In 1906, A man called Wilhelm Vogt became frustrated with Prussian bureaucracy. He had attempted to turn his back on a life of petty crime, but his previous convictions meant he couldn't get permission to live anywhere or a passport so he could leave. So, he bought himself an army captain's uniform, found some off-duty soldiers, and ordered them to accompany him. Claiming he was unable to requisition a car, he made them come with him on the train to Köpenick, at the time a town outside of Berlin. He bought them lunch, and then they marched into town, the soldiers not questioning the fact that his uniform wasn't quite right. Instead of a helmet, he was wearing a cap. They then stormed the town hall, arrested the mayor, and confiscated the money from the safe. Leaving the soldiers to guard the town hall, Vogt walked back to the station, had a beer, boarded a train, and disappeared. It was days before he was arrested, by which time he had become something of a folk hero. Germans everywhere were laughing. The Kaiser himself enjoyed the story so much that Vogt was granted a pardon, having served only half his sentence, and was allowed to emigrate to Luxembourg. The Captain of Köpenick is a legend to this day. Köpenick, meanwhile, is quite well preserved, and even has a little schloss, recently renovated and currently used by the Museum of Arts and Crafts. By this time, Berlin's population had reached 2 million and was still growing. Getting around was becoming problematic. A viaduct carrying trains from east to west across the city had already been built. This is called the Stadtbahn and still forms the backbone of Berlin's public transport system. The arches beneath the viaduct can be used as shops and bars, a fact alluded to by the architect of at least one modern shopping mall. In 1902, a new idea was put into operation. It was initially conceived as an elevated railway, but the then independent city of Charlottenburg refused to have such a thing, and so, west of Nollendorfplatz station, the line dives below ground level and the Berlin Underground Railway, the U-Bahn, was born. Wittenbergplatz station is almost a museum in its own right. The ads on the walls may look as if they're from 1920, but in fact they are modern ads designed in keeping with the station. The construction of an eastward extension towards Alexanderplatz was complicated by a combination of local politics, geology, and sheer bad luck, which explains why it's so curvy. But some of the stations on this section are quite fascinating, although it is likely a myth that Mohrenstrasse station is clad with marble from Hitler's chancellery. Spittelmarkt station is built into the riverbank. And Klosterstrasse station is a small museum of the history of Berlin's public transport. Märkisches Museum station was built much deeper than previous stations because at this point the line had to tunnel under the river. In the 1980s, a series of mosaics depicting the growth of Berlin was installed, but because this was during the Cold War, the last mosaic shows only East Berlin. The museum itself is a short walk away and had just been built a few years before the station was opened to document the history of the area. The building is itself something of a museum, different parts of it in different architectural styles from different periods, except that it was all built in the first decade of the 20th century. The museum is built next to a park which contains a bear pit, home to some European brown bears, which of course was sleeping when I got there. The bear is the symbol of Berlin, but this has nothing to do with one of the legendary founders of the city who was called Albrecht the Bear. Instead, it is a play on the city's name, Berlin, which historians think comes from an old Slavic word that means swamp. The early 20th century saw the rise of a new elite with money to spend, and department stores began opening up everywhere. The most well-known was opened in 1907 in an area that was being redeveloped just to the west of Berlin, Kaufhaus des Westens, better known as KaDeWe. It is still the largest department store on continental Europe. Harrods is bigger but is in Britain, and has the second largest grocery department of any store in the world. KaDeWe is not, as some people think, on the Kudamm, but on Tauentzienstraße, which leads to the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church. This church was heavily damaged during the war, but rather than pull it down or rebuild it, the decision was taken to preserve the ruins as a monument to the destructive power of war. Berliners started calling it the Hollow Tooth due to its appearance. A modern church was built next to it, and a bell tower on the other side, an ensemble that reminded Berliners of a lipstick and powder compact. The Kudamm, or Kurfürstendamm to give it its full name, extends west from here. All this grew up around the early 20th century as Schöneberg, Wilmersdorf, Tiergarten and Charlottenburg became known as Berlin's New West. The zoo had opened in 1844 in what at the time was open fields. It was the 9th zoo to open in Europe and today has the most comprehensive collection of species in the world. The neighbouring aquarium opened in 1913 and exhibits not only fish, but amphibians, reptiles and insects. Back in the late 17th century, the village of Lietzow was where the consort of Prince-Elector Friedrich III, Sophie Charlotte of Hanover, built a palace for herself. After she died in 1705 at the age of only 37, the Elector renamed both the palace and the village in her honour, Charlottenburg. By the 20th century, Charlottenburg had grown from a place in the country to get away from it all to a city with a population of 300,000. Berlin had had a fairly turbulent history, but its darkest chapters were yet to come. The First World War brought food shortages, strikes, and at the end of the war, the abdication of the Kaiser. This was followed by unrest and revolution and the creation of the so-called Weimar Republic, Germany's second attempt at democracy. In 1920, Berlin's borders were extended to include not just Schöneberg and Charlottenburg, but places further out, including Spandau, Zehlendorf, and of course, Köpenick. This was to prove fortunate a few decades later. Despite Berlin's problems, the Golden Twenties took hold. Berlin, now the world's 5th largest city, became a haven for artists, performers and party-goers. The nightlife is still legendary. Even if Berlin does sometimes sleep, it wakes up at 2 in the afternoon, ears still ringing. In 1921, a racetrack was built, a simple straight with a loop at either end, known to everyone as the AVUS. It is now part of the Autobahn from Charlottenburg to Potsdam, but the grandstand is still there. At the northern end of the AVUS, the radio tower was built in 1926 for the first international radio exhibition. Vaguely based on the Eiffel Tower, it was soon nicknamed the Long Beanpole. The area was already home to the Berlin Trade Fair, which is still here, although the oldest buildings still existing date from the 1930s. The original building was located where the central coach station now stands. Surprisingly, for a landlocked city, a major industry was shipping, as Berlin had easy access to the Oder and the Elbe rivers, making it an important location for inland navigation. Goods could be offloaded here and transferred onto trains. For a short while, it looked as if Berlin was going from strength to strength. But the economic after effects of the First World War and the Great Depression put an end to that in 1929, and the people looked for somebody who could put things right again. The stage was set for the rise of the National Socialists, the Nazis. The worst excesses of the Nazis are well known: the concentration camps, the violent anti-Semitism, the warmongering. The Holocaust Memorial commemorates the near genocide of the Jews. Other victims of the regime have their memorials as well. The new synagogue actually survived the Nazi pogrom of 9th of November 1938, when local police officers, in defiance of the political situation at the time, ordered the mob to disperse. However, the synagogue was later hit by British bombs, and now only the facade of the original remains. But the effects that the Nazis had on Berlin itself are still very visible. Essentially, the plan was to replace Berlin with a new city to be called Germania, a city fit to be the capital of a new, powerful and invincible empire. Most of the planned work was never begun, let alone finished, but there is enough to give a taste of what would have been. The master plan was to have two great roads, an east-west axis and a north-south axis. The east-west axis already partially existed as a long, straight road from the city Schloss all the way to Charlottenburg, but it was to be widened and lined with impressive buildings. Mostly, they got as far as installing new streetlights. The Victory Column has pride of place on this axis. It was built in 1873 to commemorate a few German military victories, but it was moved here from its original position in front of the Reichstag, not as some guidebooks claim because it annoyed Hitler, but simply to give it more prominence. The figure of the goddess Victoria is known to Berliners as Golden Elsie, and used to be known by American troops stationed here as the Chick on the Stick. The north-south axis was never actually built, but near the southern end is a very curious object, the heavy load-bearing body. This was built at the spot planned for a huge triumphal arch, but it wasn't known if the wet, sandy Berlin soil could take it. 12,650 tons of concrete were used to construct an object that rose 14 meters above ground and reached 18 meters below ground. Inside, measuring instruments were installed to monitor how the object would sink and settle. The results couldn't be analysed until after the war, but in the end it was found that yes, the arch could have been built if the ground was first compacted. Since the body is in a residential area, there was no way it could be demolished safely. The original plan was simply to build over it, and so it still stands, open to the public as a monument to the megalomania of the Third Reich. Not far away is Tempelhof Airport. It had in fact been in operation since 1924, but by the Nazi period had reached full capacity and needed to be replaced. In typical Nazi style, the new terminal building was intimidatingly huge, and for a couple of short years until the completion of the Pentagon, it was the world's largest building. After the war, the US Air Force continued to use the airport, and in 1985 it reopened for civilian flights, eventually closing in 2008 to be turned into an urban park. This area had once been a military parade ground, but its connection with air travel started as early as 1909, when Orville Wright demonstrated his new flying machine here. Perhaps the most famous Nazi building is the Olympic Stadium, home to the controversial 1936 Summer Games. This was, for the Nazis, a major propaganda coup, and they were determined to show Germany at its best. The torch relay, now an essential part of the opening ceremony, was actually instituted by the Nazis. It's not true that Hitler fled the stadium in order not to have to present gold medals to non-German athletes. It is, however, perfectly true that one black American athlete in particular put to the test the Nazi mythology of the master race. But Europe was heading once again for war. This block of flats was built over a Nazi-era air raid shelter, which survived not only the war but subsequent attempts to demolish it. It can still be used as a shelter today, with spaces for nearly 5,000 people. The war, when it came, proved devastating to Berlin. In the city centre, about half the buildings were completely destroyed, the infrastructure demolished. It was the Soviet Red Army that finally liberated Berlin, but with Hitler ordering what troops he had left to fight to the last, it was a long and bloody battle in which 80,000 Russians died. The Soviets soon erected a war memorial where the Nazis had planned the north-south axis to intersect with the east-west axis. The memorial includes tanks and guns used in the Battle of Berlin, and the unmarked graves of somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 soldiers. When Berlin was divided, this memorial ended up in the British sector, but the Red Army was allowed to maintain a guard of honour here until the troops finally withdrew in 1994. The main Soviet war memorial, though, is further east in Treptower Park. Another 7,000 soldiers are buried here. Meanwhile, Germany, what was left of it, was occupied by the four Allies and divided into zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. The city of Berlin was a special case and was itself divided into four sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. The occupying powers administering Berlin worked together to get the basic infrastructure working, but the Soviets were the ideological enemies of the other three, and the alliance based on a common hatred of the Nazis began to fall apart. In 1948, the Soviet member of the Allied Kommandantura administering Berlin simply refused to attend. And then, the Soviets tried to gain control over West Berlin's economy. In June of that year, they blocked all road and rail connections to the city. The Western Allies responded with the Berlin Airlift. Food and supplies were flown in and manufactured goods flown out during a daring operation that saw planes landing and taking off at Tempelhof every few minutes. A monument to the airlift is located in the square outside the airport. A duplicate can be seen at the US military airport in Frankfurt. After 11 months of this, the Soviets called off the blockade. But the Iron Curtain was descending over Europe. Students and lecturers at the Humboldt University, which was now in the Soviet sector, were being arrested and deported by the Soviet secret police if they opposed the increasing communist influence. A group of them started their own university in Dahlem, a residential area safely inside the American sector and probably one of the few places in the world that has a metro station with a thatched roof. Today, the Free University of Berlin has 35,000 students and is one of Germany's most prestigious. In the spring of 1949, the Western zones formed a new country, the Federal Republic of Germany. Its constitution named Greater Berlin as one of its constituent states. 4 months later, the German Democratic Republic was founded, and its constitution stated that Germany was indivisible and its capital was Berlin. In 1950, the Berlin Constitution came into force in the western sectors only, and it stated that Berlin was a state of the Federal Republic, but the Allies didn't allow this clause to come into effect. The situation was tense, and it was only going to get worse. The two halves of Berlin set about rebuilding separately, and the dream of a true socialist state was to be realized in the GDR, symbolized by the construction of veritable palaces for the workers. Stalin Alley, this was to be called, only to be renamed after Stalin's fall from grace. The apartment blocks were actually well designed and built, but the builders weren't happy. On the 17th of June 1953, about 60 workers staged a demonstration to protest against poor pay and conditions. More and more people, including West Berliners, joined the demonstration and even set fire to a police station. The East Berlin authorities responded by appealing to the Soviet army for help. In the resulting clashes, 153 demonstrators were killed. Just a few days later, the West Berlin Senate approved the renaming of part of the East-West axis in memory of this event. The situation was now dangerous. In 1961, the unthinkable happened. The East Germans built fortifications around West Berlin, cutting it off not only from East Berlin, but from East Germany. In their propaganda, they referred to it as an anti-fascist protection wall to prevent infiltration by Western spies and terrorists. Few people believed that explanation. The construction of the wall led to some odd effects. The public transport system, obviously, was affected. One U-Bahn line was divided into two, as was the Stadtbahn. But the north-south S-Bahn tunnel and two U-Bahn lines suffered a curious fate. They lay mostly in West Berlin, but their middle sections ran through East Berlin. The stations along these sections were all closed, and West Berlin trains ran through them without stopping. These were Berlin's ghost stations. The exception was Friedrichstraße station, where the two S-Bahn lines intersected with an U-Bahn line. Westerners could actually change trains here. If they had the appropriate visa, they could pass through a checkpoint and visit East Berlin for the day. The building that housed the border control point for people leaving East Berlin became known as the Palace of Tears, as so many emotional farewells took place here. Westerners had to catch the last train home before their visas ran out at midnight, while their loved ones had to stay behind. Today, it houses an exhibition on divided Berlin. There were various other crossing points, each for different categories of visitor. The best known is, of course, Checkpoint Charlie, the crossing point for diplomats and foreigners. The wall was more than just a wall. To really appreciate the scale of the thing, you have to visit the memorial on Bernauer Straße. Here, West Berlin is on the right. The metal poles mark where the familiar wall itself was. Most of this strip was filled with defense systems of all kinds, watchtowers, floodlights, and a second wall to keep East Berliners well away. This was the feared death strip. These markings show where people dug tunnels to escape to the west. These, buildings that were demolished to make way for the installations. On this spot, the Church of the Reconciliation stood. Originally it was allowed to remain standing and the spire used as a watchtower, but it was finally demolished in 1985. Today, a modern chapel has been built. 4 days a week, a 15-minute meditation is held, at which the biography of one of the people who died trying to cross the wall is read out. The wall was built entirely on Eastern territory, usually a metre or so from the actual border, sometimes more, and this could be deadly. Here, near the Oberbaum Bridge, although the physical wall was built on the far bank, the entire river was East Berlin territory. In separate incidents, 5 West Berlin children drowned after falling in the river, and anyone diving in to rescue them would have been shot. This, by the way, is the famous East Side Gallery, a segment of the wall that is now an open-air art gallery. Berlin and the world had to get used to living with the world's deadliest border running straight through the middle. West Berlin's mayor had his office in the Schöneberg Town Hall, and it was on this balcony that John F. Kennedy lifted West Berliners' spirits with a now famous speech.
Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner.
This speech probably ranks among the greatest ever made, and succeeded in reassuring West Berliners that the Western world would never abandon them. Kennedy's assassination just a few months later shocked West Berliners almost as much as it did Americans.
It starts with an itch and a tingle, and then it builds and expands. And suddenly, all at once, my legs won't let me stand.
East Berlin, centered around Alexanderplatz, continued with its program of urban redevelopment. The results were not always beautiful, but in fact, if you managed to stay out of trouble, life in this part of the city could be quite agreeable. Not luxurious, but comfortable.
There's something that lives inside me. I promise I'll never let it out. Oh.
The DDR Museum showcases life in the socialist state, and its restaurant offers a selection of typical dishes.
Making a home beneath my skin.
West Berlin, with the zoo its new centre, suffered a bit. A walled-in half-city is not easy to sell as a nice place to live. Formerly upmarket inner city areas like Kreuzberg found themselves hard up against the wall and people moved out. But there were always people to replace them, and the area became a haven for students, artists, university dropouts, and people seeking an alternative lifestyle. Aided by West Berlin's policies aimed at encouraging anyone at all to live there, Kreuzberg became decidedly bohemian. SO36 was its pre-war postal code. It is also the name of a famous nightclub, one of many in Berlin that pioneered new forms of music: punk, new wave, techno.
Never let it end. Oh. It grows and divides inside me. It's making a home beneath my skin.
West Berlin also attracted immigrants, mostly from Turkey, brought in to make up for an acute labour shortage. So many of them settled around the Cottbusser Tor area that it became known as Little Istanbul, and the U-Bahn line as the Orient Express. With most of the important cultural venues beyond the wall in East Berlin, the West had to build some of its own. And so, surrounding St. Matthew's Church, the Culture Forum was built. The new National Gallery, based on a design originally for a sugar factory. The State Library, which took more than 10 years to build. The Philharmonie with the Great Hall and the Chamber Music Hall. The Portrait Gallery. The Museum of Prints and Drawings. The Museum of Arts and Crafts. And the Museum of Musical Instruments. A short distance away, the Congress Hall, now the House of World Cultures, was built in what at the time was, for Germany, a strikingly new form, and immediately became known as the Pregnant Oyster. It partially collapsed in 1980, but contrary to a popular myth, this didn't supply a local band with its name, Einstürzende Neubauten, meaning collapsing new buildings. The band had already settled on that name. It was simply a coincidence. Thanks to the incorporation in 1920 of so many cities and towns, Berlin has large areas of lake and forest inside its official border. This meant that when Berlin was divided, West Berliners could still go for walks in the country, and there was even an artificial bathing beach. At the extreme southwest corner of the city, a bus takes you through the forest to the Kliniker Bridge, right on the border. The other side of the bridge is the East German city of Potsdam. This is the famous Bridge of Spies, where, during the Cold War, a number of spy swaps took place. All in all, the situation was bad, but not impossible. The wall eventually came down in 1989, but by mistake. By this time, political reforms in Eastern Europe had already allowed borders to open up. Only the German Democratic Republic maintained a hard line. But now, East Germans could escape to the west by travelling through Hungary or later Czechoslovakia to Austria, and from there to West Germany. Meanwhile, in East Germany, peaceful demonstrations put pressure on the government. On the 9th of November 1989, at a press conference in East Berlin, the East German press secretary Günter Schabowski accidentally read out a draft press release he shouldn't have. The assembled journalists were quick to realize what the text actually meant, and within hours, TV and radio were wrongly reporting that the Berlin Wall was open. By nightfall, crowds of East Berliners had gathered at the Bornholmer Straße border crossing, taking guards by surprise. They'd had no orders, but because of the crush, started letting people through. As they did so, they stamped their passports. What the people at the time didn't know was that their passports had been cancelled, the intention being not to allow them back again. But the crowds kept coming, and the guards feared a riot which would have resulted in many casualties. Eventually, half an hour before midnight, Oberstleutnant Harald Jäger, faced with an impossible situation and with no help from his superiors, opened the border completely, allowing everyone to pass at will. By midnight, all the crossing points were open. The Berlin Wall had fallen. November the 9th isn't celebrated as it also happens to be the date of the Nazi pogroms against the Jews. Instead, the date of political reunification, October the 3rd, is celebrated as a national holiday. The wall was gone, the Second World War officially ended, Germany no longer being occupied by foreign powers, and the long and difficult process of rebuilding began. David Bowie's song Where Are We Now opens with these lines. Had to get the train from Potsdamer Platz. You never knew that I could do that. This is a reference to the fact that when Bowie was in Berlin, Potsdamer Platz S-Bahn station was one of the ghost stations, located directly under the death strip. Now, the station has been reopened and the whole Potsdamer Platz and Leipziger Platz area completely redeveloped, a process only now coming to an end. This was once Berlin's busiest square, as symbolized by a modern copy of Germany's first set of traffic lights. Almost nothing of Potsdamer Platz survived the war and the building of the wall. Some small fragments of the Hotel Esplanade, one of Berlin's most famous hotels during the Golden 20s, survived and are now integrated into the ultra-modern Sony Center. This wasn't intended. The architects hadn't been told these remains were under a protection order and assumed they could simply pull them down. When this wasn't possible, to avoid having to redesign the new building, they got permission to physically move the Kaiser's Hall 75 meters from its original position. With reunification, Berlin regained its status as Germany's capital city, and the Bundestag prepared to move from its seat in Bonn. A new government quarter had to be built. An area just to the north of the Reichstag had been demolished by the Nazis to make way for an over-dimensioned People's Hall, with only the Swiss embassy remaining. This was the perfect spot to build new government buildings. They symbolically span the river Spree, where it used to form part of the border between East and West Berlin. The Chancellery, by the way, is the official office and residence of the German Chancellor, who is head of government. As is normal in European countries, the head of state is a different person. The German president, whose role is largely ceremonial, works at nearby Schloss Bellevue, a much older building dating from the 1780s. Instead of a number of terminuses being rebuilt, a brand new central train station was built where the main elevated east-west line crosses the new underground north-south line. With 300,000 passengers a day, it is Germany's fourth busiest station. One or two aspects of East German life have survived reunification. The traffic lights, for example. The generic West German stick figures were never regarded with as much fondness as East Germany's red and green men, which, by popular demand, continue to be used and even fitted to new traffic lights. They're also probably the only traffic lights in the world with their own merchandising. As well as the obvious, more profound changes are taking place. Rents and property prices are rising. Many of the formerly bohemian areas of Berlin are slowly becoming gentrified, much to the disgust of some residents. But Berlin has always seen rapid change and upheaval. It's always had a certain slightly subversive edge, and as long as that isn't lost, the future is probably, on balance, good.
don't stop.